Imagine a world where the most feared individuals were not those sitting on thrones, but those banished from them. Think about that for a moment. We often assume that power resides with kings and emperors, those who command armies from palaces and issue decrees from seats of authority. But throughout history, some of the most formidable figures were actually cast out from their own societies, forced to wander, stripped of titles, and exiled beyond the borders of everything they once knew. And yet, in a stunning paradox, these very individuals often rose to wield influence so profound that they could shape the fate of empires from the shadows. Today, we're setting out on a journey to explore one of history's greatest mysteries: why ancient exiles, men like Themistocles of Athens, who turned to advise the Persian king after being ostracized by his own people, or Coriolanus of Rome, who led foreign armies against his homeland, sometimes became far more powerful than the rulers who had exiled them. What was it about exile that transformed political outcasts into legendary players on the world stage? How did losing everything, status, home, and security, paradoxically grant them a kind of freedom and leverage that throne-bound monarchs could only dream of? This isn't just a story about ancient history. It's about resilience, reinvention, and the raw mechanics of power itself. We'll venture into the forgotten corners of the past, from the bustling agoras of Greece to the formidable forums of Rome, to uncover how exile didn't just punish these individuals, it unleashed them. They built networks across kingdoms, mastered the art of diplomacy from afar, turned military knowledge into mercenary influence, and even shaped culture and thought in ways that outlasted the reigns of the kings who had cast them out. You're about to discover how being an outsider, an exile, could become the ultimate advantage. This investigation will reveal timeless lessons about human adaptability, the fluid nature of influence, and the surprising truth that sometimes the greatest power lies not in holding a crown, but in having nothing left to lose. So settle in, open your mind, and join us as we unravel the stories of these fascinating figures and explore how their journeys from rejection to legendary impact still resonate with us today. But what exactly was exile in the ancient world? It's a word we throw around today, but back then, it was far more than just being told to leave. Exile was a sophisticated and often brutal political instrument. Civilizations from Greece to Rome to Persia didn't just banish people on a whim. They used exile with surgical precision to remove rivals, silence dissenting voices, and maintain a fragile social order. Think of it less as a simple punishment and more as a calculated strategy. Unlike a modern prison sentence, which confines a person within a system, ancient exile did the opposite. It ejected them from the system entirely. This was its crucial, paradoxical nature. You lost your home, your property, your status, and the protection of your city's laws. But in return, you were granted something incredibly dangerous to those in power: mobility. An exile was untethered, free to travel, to form new alliances, and to plot their next move from the safety of a rival kingdom. Consider the formal practice of ostracism in ancient Athens. Once a year, citizens would gather in the agora and cast their votes on pottery shards, ostraca, to decide if any individual had grown too powerful, too popular, or simply too threatening to the democracy. If 6,000 votes were cast against you, you were given 10 days to leave the city for a period of 10 years. It wasn't framed as a dishonorable punishment. Your property wasn't confiscated, and your family could remain. It was presented as a necessary cooling-off period for the good of the state. But for the person ostracized, this was a profound and life-altering event. A figure like Aristides, known as the Just, was famously ostracized simply because people were tired of hearing him praised for his integrity. Yet, this very act of removal didn't end his influence. It simply relocated it. Exiles like him often journeyed to the courts of other powerful city-states or even to the Empire of Persia. There, they were welcomed not as disgraced outcasts but as valuable assets. They carried intimate knowledge of Athenian politics, military strategies, and internal weaknesses. In exchange for sanctuary, they could offer their new hosts a priceless advantage. This dynamic created an entire class of displaced elites, highly educated, well-connected, and fiercely motivated individuals who now operated in the shadows between empires, playing by a completely different set of rules. They were free from the constraints of loyalty to any single polis, able to leverage their grievances and their expertise on an international stage. This unique position, born from a practice meant to neutralize them, actually laid the groundwork for a far more potent and unpredictable form of power. Now consider the profound inner journey that began the moment an exile crossed the border. Stripped of their social identity, their wealth, and the very ground beneath their feet, these individuals faced a terrifying void. But it was within this emptiness that a remarkable psychological transformation took root. This wasn't just about learning to survive. It was a complete mental rewiring, a forge where resilience was hammered out of despair and strategic genius was born from necessity. Think of the Roman general Gaius Marius. This was a man who had held the highest office of consul not once, but an unprecedented 7 times. Yet, when his political fortunes turned and he was driven out of Rome by his rival Sulla, Marius found himself utterly alone, hiding in the marshes of Myntini, a fugitive with a price on his head. In that moment, he was no longer a celebrated general. He was a desperate man fighting for his next breath. This total reduction, this loss of every external marker of power, forced a radical shift in perspective. To survive, Marius had to shed his old identity and become something new, a cunning negotiator, a master of reading people's fears and ambitions, a patient observer waiting for his moment. His exile didn't break him, it sharpened him into a finer, more dangerous instrument. He learned to see the world not from the privileged center of Roman power, but from its vulnerable edges, and that outsider's vantage point gave him insights no insider could ever possess. This process of mental adaptation was universal among history's most formidable exiles. They were suddenly students in the hardest school imaginable, and their curriculum was sheer survival. Every day demanded rapid learning in diplomacy, as they had to persuade foreign rulers to grant them sanctuary. It required mastering the art of intelligence gathering, listening for whispers in marketplaces and courts that could signal a shift in power back home or reveal a potential weakness to exploit. The Greek philosopher Aristotle found himself in this exact position. After the death of his patron, Alexander the Great, anti-Macedonian sentiment surged in Athens. Charged with impiety, a capital crime, Aristotle chose voluntary exile rather than face a trial he knew he would lose. He famously declared he would not allow Athens to sin twice against philosophy, but his departure was far from a quiet retirement. For a thinker like Aristotle, exile meant his entire world of academic inquiry, his library, and his lyceum were suddenly gone. This forced him to adapt his immense intellect to a new reality. No longer surrounded by disciples, he had to apply his logical frameworks to the immediate, practical problems of navigation, cultural negotiation, and personal safety. His philosophical observations on politics and human nature were no longer abstract. They became vital tools for understanding the motives of the powerful men whose protection he now needed. This is the core of the psychological shift. the move from being an actor within a system to becoming its analyst from the outside. When you are inside the power structure of Athens or Rome, your view is often limited by tradition, bureaucracy, and the daily grind of political rivalries. You're playing a game with established rules, but an exile watching from a distance sees the entire board with chilling clarity. They are no longer distracted by the pageantry of power. They see its underlying architecture, the cracks in the foundation, the strained alliances, the greedy officials who can be bribed, and the popular discontent that can be ignited. This detached observation granted them a strategic advantage that complacent rulers, sitting comfortably on their thrones, completely underestimated. An exile's mind becomes a map of vulnerabilities and opportunities. Every piece of news from home is analyzed not for its social gossip, but for its strategic value. A harvest failure becomes a potential lever for causing civil unrest. A rumor of a king's illness signals a moment of succession crisis to be exploited. This constant, calculated observation turned exiles into master tacticians of the long game. Their journey became one of relentless self-reinvention, shedding the skin of their former selves to become agile, pragmatic, and fiercely determined operators, always poised to seize any chance, however small, to claw their way back into the game of power, often from a distance that made them even more formidable. But that psychological transformation was only the beginning. A lone exile, no matter how sharp or resilient, was still vulnerable. The true power emerged when these isolated individuals found each other, weaving themselves into a vast and intricate tapestry of mutual support that stretched across the ancient world. Imagine a hidden, international community of the disgraced and the ambitious, a network where a fallen Athenian general could send a message to an exiled Spartan king residing at the Persian court, all through a chain of trusted contact. This wasn't just a social club for the displaced. It functioned as one of history's first and most effective intelligence agencies, operating entirely in the shadows. These exiles shared a common language of loss and a burning desire to reclaim their standing, and that made them incredibly reliable partners in a world of shifting royal allegiances. They understood that their strength lay not in solitary action, but in collective effort. A Roman senator fleeing a purge could find safe passage through Greece because a fellow exile, banished years earlier, had established a web of informants and sympathizers along the major trade routes. They pooled resources, shared critical information about political developments back home, and offered sanctuary to new arrivals, creating a self-sustaining ecosystem of influence that kings, tethered to their capitals and bound by protocol, could scarcely comprehend. Consider the practical mechanics of such a network. An exiled Spartan king like Demeratus provides a perfect case study. After being deposed in a bitter political struggle around 490 BC, he didn't simply fade into obscurity. He made his way to the glittering court of the Persian Emperor Darius. There, he was welcomed not as a refugee, but as an esteemed advisor. What did he offer in return? Invaluable insider knowledge. He understood the Spartan mindset, their legendary military tactics, their strengths, and most importantly, their cultural weaknesses. When Xerxes, the son of Darius, planned his massive invasion of Greece, Demeratus was at his side, offering strategic counsel that only a former king of Sparta could provide. He was a node in a much larger network. Meanwhile, a Greek philosopher ostracized from Athens might find a new home and a captivated audience in the court of a Macedonian king, subtly influencing the education of a young prince who would one day, like Alexander, dream of conquering the known world. These thinkers spread ideas, philosophies of governance, ethical frameworks, scientific principles that transcended the petty squabbles of city-states. Their teachings became a form of soft power that slowly reshaped the intellectual landscape of the ancient Mediterranean, creating cultural bridges between rival powers. This cross-pollination of knowledge and ambition created a shadow web of power that completely disregarded traditional national loyalties, and exiles' primary allegiance was to their own restoration and to others who could help them achieve it. This made them form alliances that would have been unthinkable within their homelands. An Athenian democrat might conspire with a Persian aristocrat if it meant applying pressure on the government that had exiled him. They could mobilize support with astonishing speed because their networks were lean, agile, and motivated by direct personal interest, unlike the sluggish state bureaucracies of kings who had to contend with councils, treasuries, and public opinion. A message carried by a trusted merchant could travel from Egypt to Rome in weeks, coordinating plans or sharing news of a rebellion. This ability to act in concert across vast distances, to leverage combined knowledge and resources, turned these disparate groups of outcasts into a formidable political force. They were no longer just individuals seeking revenge. They were a transnational entity capable of shaping foreign policy, triggering wars, and determining the fate of empires, all from the quiet corners of the palaces that gave them shelter. And so we arrive at one of the most dramatic and powerful roles an exile could assume, that of the mercenary commander. For many of these displaced elites, their most valuable currency was not gold, but knowledge, specifically military knowledge. When a general or strategist was cast out, they took with them an intimate, insider's understanding of their homeland's entire defensive apparatus. They knew the weak points in the city walls, the deployment patterns of the garrison, the secret mountain passes, the political loyalties of every regional commander, and the precise tactical doctrines drilled into their former soldiers. In the brutal marketplace of ancient warfare, this information was absolutely priceless. A king looking to invade a rival state would pay a fortune for such intelligence, but an exiled general could offer something even better. He could not only provide the blueprints to his homeland's defeat, he could personally lead the army that would achieve it. No figure embodies this shocking transformation more completely than the Athenian Alcibiades. Charismatic, brilliant, and notoriously ambitious, Alcibiades was a central architect of the disastrous Sicilian expedition during the Peloponnesian War. Facing political enemies back home who charged him with sacrilege, he made a breathtaking decision. Rather than return to Athens to face almost certain execution, he defected to its mortal enemy, Sparta. Imagine the scene in the Spartan assembly. The most famous and capable Athenian of his generation, their sworn foe, stands before them and offers not just his surrender but his active service. He advised them to immediately send a general to fortify the nearby city of Dicelia, a move that would permanently threaten Athens' food supply and lock the city in a state of siege. The Spartans, recognizing the immense strategic value of this turncoat, took his advice. Alcibiades, the Athenian patriot, then took up arms alongside the very soldiers he had been fighting against just months before. But his journey didn't end there. He later fell out of favor in Sparta as well, and his path of exile led him next to the court of the Persian satrap Tissaphernes. There, he became a trusted advisor, counseling the Persians on how to expertly play the warring Greek city-states against each other to maximize their own advantage. Alcibiades became a free agent of conflict, selling his unparalleled military and political insight to the highest bidder, and in doing so, he held the fate of the entire Greek world in his hands for years. This path was not unique. Throughout the ancient world, exile created a ready pool of highly skilled, highly motivated military talent for any ruler willing to look past their status as an outcast. A Roman legion commander, disgraced in a political purge, could find a welcoming audience with a Parthian king eager to understand the legendary Roman battle formations from someone who had helped create them. These men were more than just hired swords, they were force multipliers. They could train a foreign army to fight like a Roman legion or a Spartan phalanx. They could devise strategies specifically tailored to exploit the psychological and tactical blind spots of their former comrades. For the exile, this offered a path to immense power, wealth, and most satisfyingly, revenge. By leading a successful campaign against their homeland, they could humiliate the regime that had cast them out, demonstrating their irreplaceable value in the most brutal way possible. Often, the mere threat of such an attack was enough to bring their native city to the negotiating table. Facing the prospect of an invasion led by someone who knew all their secrets, the ruling powers might suddenly find it very prudent to offer a full pardon, the restoration of property, and even a promotion just to neutralize the threat. In this way, the exiled mercenary didn't just seek to destroy his home. He often sought to force it to beg for his return, placing him in a position where he, the outcast, could literally dictate the terms of his own reinstatement. The sword he wielded in a foreign land ultimately proved far more effective at reclaiming power than any political maneuver he could have attempted from within the city walls. Yet the influence of these exiles extended far beyond the battlefield, seeping into the delicate and shadowy realm of diplomacy, where their lack of official status became their greatest asset. A king or an official ambassador was always bound by rigid protocol, public reputation, and the explicit interests of their state. Every word they uttered was carefully weighed, every meeting observed and recorded. An exile, by contrast, operated in a world of breathtaking flexibility, with no nation to officially represent and no constituency to answer to. They could engage in the kind of back-channel negotiations and daring proposals that would be politically suicidal for a seated ruler. Their very position as an outsider, trusted completely by no one but considered useful by everyone, granted them a unique form of diplomatic immunity. They could float ideas, test boundaries, and broker deals in the quiet corners of a palace, offering all parties a layer of plausible deniability that was invaluable in the high-stakes game of ancient statecraft. The masterclass in this form of exile diplomacy was delivered by none other than Themistocles, the brilliant architect of the Greek victory at Salamis. After being ostracized by an Athens that had grown fearful of his immense prestige, he didn't fade away. Instead, he undertook a perilous journey east, right into the heart of the enemy empire he had famously defeated, Persia. Presenting himself before the new king Artaxerxes, Themistocles didn't come as a supplicant. He came as a consultant. He offered the king a simple and irresistible proposition. You want to understand and ultimately control the Greeks. Who better to explain them than the man who united them, and then outmaneuvered your father's colossal invasion force? Artaxerxes, recognizing the unparalleled strategic value sitting before him, welcomed Themistocles not as a prisoner, but as an advisor. In this role, Themistocles performed a breathtakingly delicate dance. To the Persian king, he offered genuine insights into Greek politics and military thinking, advice that was valuable enough to keep him in high esteem and comfortable exile. But he was also careful never to provide information so devastating that it would lead to the total destruction of his homeland. He became a mediator between two worlds, subtly influencing Persian policy to avoid all-out war while simultaneously sending messages back to Greek leaders, warning them of Persian intentions and positioning himself as a crucial, if unofficial, channel of communication. He was playing both sides against the middle for his own survival and influence, a feat only possible from his uniquely unaffiliated position. This is the core of the exile's diplomatic power. the ability to be a neutral, or more accurately, and self-interested intermediary. A king could never truly trust another king. Their interests were inherently opposed, but an exile's interests were transparent and personal. Everyone knew his primary goal was to secure his own safety, wealth, and perhaps a path to returning home. This made him a predictable and therefore reliable negotiating partner in his own strange way. Rivals who would never speak directly could use the exile as a go-between, a neutral zone where initial, tentative offers could be made without either side losing face if they were rejected. An exiled Roman senator, for instance, could be welcomed in the court of a Parthian king precisely because he had no official power. He could listen to the Parthians' grievances and demands, and then, through his own private networks, communicate them back to certain factions in the Roman Senate, testing the waters for a potential peace treaty that the emperor himself might not yet be willing to publicly entertain. If the proposal was shot down, the emperor could simply disavow any knowledge of it. The exile had acted on his own initiative. But if the proposal found traction, the exile would be credited with opening a vital dialogue, suddenly transforming from a disgraced outcast into an indispensable statesman. This agile movement through the complex political landscapes of the ancient world allowed exiles to shape alliances and negotiate truces that throne-bound rulers, trapped by their own grandeur and inflexibility, could only watch with a mixture of frustration and envy. They proved that true influence often resided not in the public declaration, but in the private, unattributable conversation. But beyond the battlefields and the backroom deals, another, more foundational form of power was often the key to an exile's ultimate success: cold, hard economic leverage. Stripped of their lands and state salaries, these individuals quickly learned that to influence the world, you first needed to command its resources. This drive for self-sufficiency propelled them into the vibrant and often ruthless economic networks of the ancient world, where they could build private fortunes that rivaled the treasuries of the kings who had banished them. An exile wasn't just a political refugee. He could become a merchant prince, a pirate king, or a venture capitalist of chaos, using his wealth as a direct instrument of power and revenge. While a monarch was constrained by the needs of his entire economy, responsible for feeding his population and funding his bureaucracy, an exile had no such burdens. His financial strategy could be lean, aggressive, and entirely self-serving, giving him a flexibility that traditional rulers could only envy. Consider the strategic island of Sicily in the ancient Mediterranean. For an Athenian or Corinthian exile, this wasn't just a place of refuge, it was an economic powerhouse. Sicily was one of the breadbaskets of the Greek world, its fertile plains producing vast quantities of grain that were shipped to feed the growing populations of cities like Athens. An exiled general or politician, arriving with his personal guard and a network of contacts, could use his military skills not for conquest but for commercial dominance. He might strike a deal with a local Sicilian tyrant, offering protection for the grain shipments from rival pirates or from the tyrant's own political enemies. In return, the exile would demand a percentage of the profits or, even better, control over a key port or a fleet of transport ships. Suddenly, this outcast found himself in a position to dictate terms to the very city that had ostracized him. He could threaten to cut off the grain supply to Athens during a shortage, holding the stomachs of its citizens hostage to force political concessions, a pardon, or the recall of his rivals. His power no longer came from a title granted by the Athenian assembly, but from his command of a critical resource that everyone needed. This model of resource control was replicated across the ancient world. A Roman nobleman forced into exile after losing a power struggle wouldn't simply retire to a villa to write his memoirs. he still had contacts, knowledge of Roman trade routes, and often hidden assets. He might travel to the wealthy Hellenistic East, to Alexandria or Rhodes, and use his remaining capital to invest in lucrative shipping ventures. With his understanding of Roman demand for Eastern luxuries like silk, spices, and exotic woods, he could corner a market. The profits from these ventures could then be funneled directly back into Roman politics, but from the outside. He could bankroll the campaign of a sympathetic politician back home, funding a populist movement that championed his return. He could bribe key officials in the Roman tax collection system to create economic chaos, discrediting his enemies in the Senate. He could even finance a full-scale rebellion, equipping a private army of mercenaries to march on Rome itself, all funded by his shrewd business dealings abroad. The Roman state treasury was vast, but it was also slow, bureaucratic, and subject to public scrutiny. The Exiles' private war chest, by contrast, was nimble, secret, and could be deployed with devastating precision. And for those with a more adventurous spirit, the sea lanes offered another path to immense wealth: piracy. In the unstable centuries following Alexander the Great's death, the eastern Mediterranean was plagued by pirates who operated from hidden coves in Crete and Cilicia. These weren't just simple bandits. Many were led by exiled nobles and disgraced admirals who used their superior knowledge of naval warfare to create sophisticated, floating empires. An exiled Athenian captain, for instance, knew the exact schedules of the grain fleets, the defensive capabilities of the triremes escorting them, and the weak points in the naval patrol routes. He could assemble a fleet of fast, light ships and effectively tax all commerce passing through his stretch of the sea. The wealth accumulated from this maritime predation was staggering. With it, an exile-turned-pirate king could live like royalty, building fortified palaces on remote islands, surrounded by a loyal army of cutthroats. More importantly, he could wield tremendous political influence. A city-state desperate for grain during a famine might be forced to formally negotiate with a pirate lord, granting him legitimacy and even a treaty in exchange for safe passage. Rival kings, constantly at war, might secretly hire these pirate fleets to raid their enemies' coastlines, creating a deniable, off-the-books navy. The exile, once an outcast, became a sovereign power in his own right, his authority recognized not by a crown, but by the fear he inspired and the gold he possessed. This economic independence was the ultimate game-changer. It transformed the exile from a supplicant, dependent on the charity of a foreign host, into a patron. He became the one dispensing favors, granting loans, and funding projects. A local governor facing a rebellion might turn to a wealthy exile for an emergency loan to pay his troops, indebting himself and his city to this shadowy financier. A community struggling after an earthquake might receive a generous donation for reconstruction from the same exile it had once shunned, a calculated act of charity designed to rewrite his legacy and build a new base of popular support. Through these economic channels, the exile could buy not just things but people, their loyalty, their silence, and their service. He constructed a financial empire that existed outside any single nation's borders, a stateless corporation whose sole product was influence. This gave him a form of leverage that was incredibly difficult for any king to counter. You could defeat an exile's army on the battlefield, but how do you defeat his credit line? How do you besiege his network of trade partners? How do you arrest his investments? The money he accumulated in exile became a weapon more subtle and often more powerful than any sword, allowing him to shape events from a distance and proving that true power in the ancient world often flowed not from the throne but from the treasury. Yet even as exiles built fortunes and commanded armies, they discovered a form of influence far more enduring than wealth or military might: the power to shape culture and thought itself. When a ruler banishes a philosopher or an artist, they aren't just removing a person, they are inadvertently releasing an idea into the wild, where it can spread without borders, mutate, and grow far beyond their control. This cultural and intellectual contribution became the exiles' ultimate revenge and most lasting legacy. No longer confined to the salons and forums of their homeland, these thinkers and creators became roving ambassadors of innovation, their work gaining a new potency precisely because it was forged in the fires of displacement and critique. A king's decree might command obedience for a generation, but an exile's poem or philosophical treatise could echo for millennia, quietly undermining the very foundations of the power that cast them out. Consider the profound case of the Roman poet Ovid. In the year 8 AD, at the height of his fame and artistic power, he was abruptly ordered by Emperor Augustus to leave Rome forever and live out his days in the remote, bleak port town of Tomis on the Black Sea coast. The exact reasons for his exile remain one of history's great mysteries, perhaps a poem deemed immoral, or his knowledge of a scandal within the imperial family. But the punishment was designed to be a living death, to sever Rome's most celebrated wordsmith from his audience, his language, and the vibrant cultural heart that fed his creativity. Augustus likely expected Ovid to fade into a silent, miserable obscurity. Instead, the opposite occurred. Isolated and heartsick, Ovid did the one thing he could still do: he wrote. From that distant frontier, he produced two monumental works of poetry, Tristia Sorrows and Epistulae ex Ponto, Letters from the Black Sea. These were not mere lamentations, they were brilliant, subversive, and deeply human documents. In them, Ovid poured out his grief, his longing for home, and his pointed, though carefully veiled, critiques of Augustus's autocratic rule. He portrayed the emperor not as a benevolent father of the nation, but as a capricious, unforgiving god, a remote figure who could shatter a life with a single word. These poems were then smuggled back to Rome, where they were copied, read, and discussed in hushed tones. Ovid, the absent author, became more present than ever. His personal suffering, rendered in beautiful, heartbreaking verse, became a powerful commentary on the nature of injustice and the abuse of power. He couldn't vote in the Senate or lead a legion, but from his exile, he shaped the emotional and intellectual landscape of an entire generation of Romans, ensuring that Augustus's reign would be remembered not only for its peace and prosperity, but also for its cruel silencing of a brilliant voice. His work outlived the empire itself, inspiring countless others who felt powerless in the face of authority. This phenomenon was not confined to Rome. Across the ancient world, exile acted as a bizarre and unintended engine of cultural exchange. A Greek sculptor, deemed too innovative or too critical by the conservative elders of his city, would be driven out, only to be eagerly snapped up by a Persian king or an Egyptian pharaoh. These rulers, often eager to display their own sophistication and worldliness, were desperate to incorporate the latest Hellenic artistic styles into their palaces and temples. The exile, free from the strict stylistic conventions of his homeland, could experiment and blend traditions, creating breathtaking new forms. In the employ of a foreign patron, a Greek artist might design a statue of an Egyptian god with the idealized proportions of a Greek athlete, or inlay a Persian throne with motifs borrowed from Mesopotamian myths. This cultural fusion, born from the mobility of exiled talent, gave rise to entirely new artistic movements like Greco-Buddhist art in Central Asia, which merged classical Greek techniques with Buddhist spiritual themes to create some of the most serene and powerful sculptures in human history. The king who had banished the artist might still be ruling his small city-state, but the exile's work was now decorating the halls of global empires, influencing aesthetic tastes across continents. This was the exile's soft power, an influence that operated not through fear or force, but through persuasion, beauty, and the compelling nature of ideas. A philosopher like Aristotle, as we mentioned, taught in exile, and his students would go on to teach others, creating a ripple effect that shaped centuries of scientific and philosophical inquiry. An exiled historian, writing from the safety of a foreign library, could produce the definitive account of his homeland's history, but from a critical distance that those inside the country could never achieve. His version of events, questioning official propaganda and highlighting the follies of leaders, would then become the standard text for future generations. This intellectual clout was something that terrified authoritarian rulers because it was so difficult to combat. You can execute a rebel, but you cannot easily kill a compelling idea once it has been written down and circulated. The exile's book, poem, or artistic style could be copied and spread across trade routes, hidden in scroll cases on merchant ships, and discussed in forums from Spain to India. This cultural output built legacies that outlasted dynasties. We remember Ovid's poetry long after we've forgotten the specific laws of Augustus. We admire the hybrid artworks of anonymous exiled artists, while the names of the kings who briefly employed them are footnotes in history. They proved that the most formidable power is often not the power to command bodies, but the power to captivate minds. To truly grasp the mechanics of exile power, we must turn from the general to the specific, from the abstract principle to the breathtakingly audacious life of one man, Themistocles of Athens. Here was a figure who reached the absolute pinnacle of glory, hailed as the savior of all Greece for his strategic genius at the Battle of Salamis, where his cunning and the Athenian navy he built turned the tide against the seemingly invincible Persian invasion force. He was the hero of the hour, the man who had secured Athens' future as a dominant power. Yet, within a decade, that very city would vote to ostracize him, casting him out for a period of 10 years. The reason, the same ambition and towering intellect that had saved them now frightened them. In the jealous, petty world of Athenian politics, his rivals, led by the conservative aristocrat Cimon, successfully painted him as a potential tyrant, a man whose popularity had grown too dangerous for their young democracy. So the man who had delivered victory was handed a verdict of exile, forced to abandon his home, his family, and the city he had sculpted into a naval empire. But for a mind like Themistocles, exile was not an end. It was merely a change of theater. He didn't retreat into obscurity. Instead, he embarked on the most daring and counterintuitive journey imaginable. He traveled east, directly into the heart of the enemy empire he had humiliated. His destination was the magnificent court of the new Persian king, Artaxerxes. This was an act of staggering psychological boldness. Imagine the scene: the architect of Persia's greatest naval defeat presenting himself not as a prisoner or a supplicant, but as a potential asset. His message to the king was a masterpiece of strategic repositioning. He essentially said, "I am the man who defeated your father, Xerxes. I understand the Greek mind, their tactics, their weaknesses, and their endless internal squabbles better than any other living soul. That knowledge which was used against you can now be used for you." Artaxerxes, a shrewd ruler himself, recognized the immense value in this offer. Here was not just a traitor, but a master strategist offering a PhD-level course in how to manage, manipulate, and potentially conquer the Greek world. The king granted him sanctuary, a generous estate, and a position as a trusted advisor. This is where Themistocles' story transforms from a simple tale of betrayal into a nuanced lesson in transnational power. He didn't simply switch sides. He entered into a complex, high-stakes dance. For his Persian patron, he provided genuinely valuable counsel. He explained the fractious nature of Greek city-states, advising the king on how to play them against one another through diplomacy and subsidies, a strategy of divide and conquer that would save Persia the immense cost of another full-scale invasion. This advice was sound enough to keep him in the king's good graces and living in comfort, but simultaneously, Themistocles was playing a deeper game. He was careful to never provide intelligence so specific or devastating that it would lead to the utter annihilation of Athens or the other Greek states. He understood that his value to the Persians was predicated on the continued existence of a fractured Greece. If Greece were completely pacified, his expertise would become instantly obsolete. He became a subtle brake on Persian ambitions, counseling patience and indirect influence over outright war. Furthermore, he used his privileged position as a channel of communication. He could send messages back to his contacts in Greece, warning them of Persian intentions or the shifting political winds at the royal court. This allowed him to position himself as an indispensable, if unofficial, intermediary. Both sides, the Greeks and the Persians, found him useful, and his safety was secured by his utility to both. He negotiated benefits for himself, yes, but he also negotiated a precarious peace. His insider knowledge became a form of currency that he spent with extreme care, maintaining a balance of power that served his own survival. Themistocles in exile was no longer an Athenian general. He was a free agent of geopolitics, a man whose influence derived entirely from his intellect and his unique position straddling two worlds. His power was no longer granted by the vote of the Athenian assembly. It was forged in the fires of his own cunning and his profound understanding of the fears and desires of kings. He demonstrated that true influence could exist without a title, without an army, and without a homeland, residing instead in the strategic application of knowledge from the unlikeliest of places. If the story of Themistocles shows us the subtle, diplomatic power an exile could wield through cunning and counsel, then the tale of Gaius Marcius Coriolanus presents the stark, brutal opposite, a lesson in the raw, terrifying force of military revenge. Here was a man whose very identity was forged in the fires of Roman virtue and martial glory, a hero who had earned his famous agnomen, Coriolanus, through an act of breathtaking valor. During the siege of the Volscian city of Corioli, he had fought with such ferocious, single-minded courage that he was hailed as the primary reason for the Roman victory. He was the embodiment of the aristocratic ideal, a patrician, a warrior, and a man utterly devoted to the state. But that same unyielding, rigid pride that made him a magnificent soldier would also be his undoing in the complex political arena of Rome. His contempt for the common people, the plebeians, was not a private prejudice but a public and vocal disdain. He opposed the distribution of grain during a famine unless the people agreed to relinquish their newly won political rights, the protections of the tribunes. This was a fatal miscalculation. The people, already hungry and now humiliated, turned on him. Charged with aspiring to tyranny, this celebrated war hero was put on trial and, despite his service, sentenced to exile, cast out from the city he had bled to defend. For a man like Coriolanus, whose entire sense of self was built upon his status as Rome's greatest defender, this was not just a punishment, it was an unforgivable, soul-shattering insult. And his reaction was not one of quiet sorrow or strategic repositioning. It was a volcano of rage, a desire for vengeance so pure and all-consuming that it would redefine the very nature of threat. He did not journey to a distant, glittering court to offer his services as an advisor. Instead, he walked directly into the camp of Rome's bitter enemies, the Volscians, the very people he had defeated at Corioli. He presented himself to their leader, Tullus Aufidius, his former rival on the battlefield, and made a stunning proposition. He offered the Volscians not just his sword, but his intimate, total knowledge of Rome's military strategy, its defensive fortifications, and the psychological weaknesses of its commanders. He knew the exact layout of the city's walls, the patrol schedules of the legions, the supply routes that could be severed, and the political factions whose infighting would prevent a unified defense. This was the ultimate nightmare for any state, their finest military mind now turned against them with nothing left to lose. The result was a campaign of pure, terrifying efficiency. Under Coriolanus's command, the Volscian army became an unstoppable force. He led them from victory to victory, not as a foreign advisor, but as their chief general, systematically conquering Roman territories and colonies that had once been his to protect. One by one, towns that had cheered his name now fell to his armies. He bypassed strongholds and targeted weaknesses with a precision that only an insider could possess. He wasn't just defeating Rome, he was methodically dismantling it, demonstrating with every march and siege that the city had exiled the one man capable of saving it from itself. The Roman legions, once invincible under his leadership, now faltered against their former champion. Panic seized the city. The Senate, which had condemned him, sent priests and diplomats to plead with him, offering to reverse his exile and restore his honors. But Coriolanus, hardened by betrayal, dismissed them. His terms were no longer about restoration, they were about submission. He demanded the return of all land conquered from the Volscians, a massive territorial concession, and full rights for his Volscian allies within Rome itself. The exiled outcast was no longer asking for a pardon. He was dictating the terms of Rome's surrender from the field of battle, holding his entire homeland hostage to his wrath. The power dynamic had been completely inverted. The state that had cast him out was now utterly at his mercy, and it took the most personal, apolitical appeal imaginable to break his resolve. A delegation of Rome's most esteemed women, led by his mother, Veturia, and his wife, Volumnia, journeyed to his camp. They did not come to negotiate as diplomats, but to plead as family. His mother's appeal cut through the armor of his rage, shaming him not as a general, but as a son. She asked if he could truly bring himself to trample the soil of the land that gave him life, forcing him to choose between his vengeful pride and the fundamental bonds of family and birthplace. This emotional intervention, this reminder of an identity deeper than that of a soldier or an exile, is what finally stayed his hand. He withdrew the Volscian armies, sparing Rome, but in doing so, he signed his own death warrant. He had betrayed his new allies, the Volscians, and was subsequently assassinated by them. Coriolanus's story is the ultimate, tragic example of exile's amplifying power. It took a disgraced noble and transformed him into a force so potent that he could bring the world's future empire to the very brink of annihilation. His capability, honed by Rome and then unleashed against it, proved that an exile's threat level wasn't just about the armies he led, but about the intimate, devastating knowledge he carried, the knowledge of home turned into a weapon. This constant churn of displaced talent, this endless circulation of the ambitious and the aggrieved, did more than just alter individual destinies. It fundamentally shaped the rise and fall of entire empires. Exiles were not mere spectators to history. They were its accelerants and its architects, their personal quests for redemption or revenge often triggering seismic shifts in the balance of power that redrew the map of the ancient world. A single individual, cast out from their homeland and burning with a desire to reclaim what was lost, could become the spark that ignited a war, brokered an unlikely alliance, or forced a kingdom to reform from the outside in. Their actions created ripple effects that could topple dynasties or forge new ones. proving that the most powerful forces in history are not always the armies in the field, but the ideas and ambitions carried on the backs of those with nothing left to lose. Consider the explosive case of Cyrus the Younger, a Persian prince of the mighty Achaemenid Empire. As the younger son of Emperor Darius II, Cyrus harbored a burning belief that he was destined for the throne, not his older brother, who would become Artaxerxes II. When his father died, Cyrus's worst fears were realized. His brother assumed power, and Cyrus found himself effectively sidelined, his influence curtailed and his ambitions boxed in. While not formally exiled, he was strategically marginalized, sent to govern the distant provinces of Asia Minor, a move designed to keep him far from the centers of power in Persia. For a man of Cyrus's drive, this was an exile in everything but name. But instead of accepting his diminished role, he used his remote governorship as a launchpad for rebellion. From his base in Sardis, he began assembling a massive army, drawing not only on his Persian loyalists but on a resource that would prove decisive: Greek mercenaries. And who were the commanders of these highly disciplined foreign troops? Often, they were themselves exiles, Athenian and Spartan officers who brought their military expertise and their own thirst for glory and plunder to Cyrus's cause. This rebellion, fueled by the grievances of a quasi-exiled prince and led by the military skill of foreign outcasts, culminated in the epic Battle of Cunaxa in 401 BC. Though Cyrus was killed on the field, the aftermath was even more consequential. His Greek mercenaries, now stranded deep in hostile Persian territory, began their famous March of the 10,000, fighting their way back to the sea. This grueling retreat demonstrated something astonishing to the Greek world: that the vast, seemingly invincible Persian Empire had a soft interior, that its heartland was vulnerable to a determined, well-trained force. This revelation, delivered by an army initially assembled by an exiled prince, planted the seed for future invasions. It directly inspired Philip II of Macedon, and ultimately his son Alexander, to envision the conquest of Persia. The ambition of one marginalized royal, therefore, inadvertently exposed the empire's weakness and set in motion the chain of events that would lead to its eventual downfall. Yet the influence of exiles was not always destructive. Sometimes their return became the catalyst for profound renewal and strengthening of the state that had once rejected them. This was the power of cross-pollination, of the exile as a carrier of innovative ideas. A thinker or statesman banished from one culture would spend years absorbing the customs, technologies, and governing philosophies of another. Then, if fortune turned, they might be invited back home, bringing with them a treasure trove of foreign knowledge that could revolutionize their native land. The Macedonian court of King Philip II is a perfect example of this phenomenon. Philip was a brilliant strategist who understood that to transform his relatively backward kingdom into a power that could challenge Greece and Persia, he needed the best minds of the age. And where did he find many of them among the exiles? He actively recruited Greek tutors, diplomats, and military theorists who had been forced out of their own city-states due to political turmoil. The most famous of these was the philosopher Aristotle, who, though not exiled at the time, came from a tradition where intellectual exile was common. He spent years at the Macedonian court tutoring Philip's young son, Alexander. The education Aristotle provided, a synthesis of Greek philosophy, science, and political theory, was utterly foreign to the traditional Macedonian warrior aristocracy. It fundamentally shaped Alexander's worldview, giving him the intellectual framework and the boundless curiosity that would later drive his conquests and his attempts to fuse Greek and Persian cultures. Other exiles advised Philip on military reform, helping him refine the phalanx formation that would become the unstoppable backbone of Alexander's armies. These returning exiles, or those who advised from abroad, didn't just serve Macedonia, they upgraded its entire operating system. They provided the intellectual capital and the sophisticated statecraft that allowed a regional power to suddenly explode onto the world stage and build an empire. The very act of casting out these brilliant minds had created a diaspora of innovation, and a shrewd king like Philip knew how to harness that power, turning the brain drain of other states into his own greatest advantage. This dynamic reveals the profound irony at the heart of Exile's role in history. A ruler's decision to banish a rival was meant to consolidate their own power by removing a threat. But in reality, they were often unleashing a far more dangerous and unpredictable force into the world. The exile, now free from the constraints of loyalty and protocol, could operate on an international scale, playing empires against each other. They could transform a personal grudge into a geopolitical event. A king on his throne had to worry about harvests, court etiquette, and placating priests. An exile had only one focus, their goal. That singular, relentless drive made them agents of chaos and change, the human catalyst that could accelerate the slow march of history into a sprint. They were the ultimate wild cards, and in a world where empires rose and fell on the strength of ideas and ambition, the outcast often held the most compelling cards of all. Yet beyond the raw mechanics of military strategy and economic leverage, exiles discovered a form of influence that was perhaps the most terrifying to authoritarian rulers, the power of the symbol. When a king banishes a critic, he intends to silence them, to erase their voice from public discourse. But throughout history, this act of removal often had the opposite effect. It transformed the individual from a mere political opponent into a potent emblem of resistance, a living representation of ideals that the state could not control. Stripped of their property, their home, and their official status, these figures were paradoxically purified, their motives no longer clouded by personal ambition or the compromises of power. Their suffering and their physical distance from the centers of authority granted them a moral credibility that no throne-bound monarch could ever hope to possess. They became, in essence, the conscience of a nation speaking from outside its borders, and that voice could gather a following more powerful than any army. Consider the profound legacy of the Hebrew prophets, figures like Jeremiah or Ezekiel. They were not exiled for military treachery or economic crimes. They were banished for speaking uncomfortable truths to power, for warning their kings and their people about the moral and spiritual consequences of their actions. When the Babylonian Empire conquered Judah and carried its leading citizens into captivity, these prophets found themselves in a foreign land. But rather than fading into despair, they began to write, to preach, and to organize. From the banks of the rivers of Babylon, they articulated a powerful vision of hope, justice, and eventual return. Their authority did not come from any official title granted by the Babylonian authorities or the crumbling Judean monarchy. It came from their unwavering commitment to a higher law, a divine covenant that they believed transcended the temporary power of any earthly king. Their writings, circulated among the exiles, became the foundational texts that preserved Jewish identity, law, and culture during decades of displacement. They provided the ideological blueprint for what a just society should look like, offering a devastating critique of the corrupt rulers who had led the nation to ruin. A king in his palace could command obedience through fear, but a prophet in exile could command the hearts and minds of an entire people through the compelling power of a shared ideal. They weren't just predicting the future, they were shaping it, forging a resilient community in captivity that would one day return to rebuild, its identity strengthened and refined by the very experience of exile. This phenomenon was not confined to the ancient Near East. In the Roman Republic, the office of the tribune was established to protect the rights of the common people, the plebeians, against the overreach of the aristocratic patricians. These tribunes possessed a sacred personal inviolability. To harm them was considered a sacrilege. But when political winds shifted and populist reformers were driven from the city by conservative factions, their exile transformed them into something even more powerful. A tribune like Tiberius Gracchus, though assassinated before formal exile, or his brother Gaius, who was killed while fleeing, became martyrs. Their successors, who were often forced into exile, carried that mantle. An exiled tribune living in a Greek city or in the camp of a sympathetic general became a living symbol of the Republic's broken promises. His very existence was a constant, nagging reminder to the common people of Rome that their protectors had been violently expelled by the elite. Letters and speeches from these exiled tribunes would be smuggled into the city, read aloud in forums and taverns, stirring popular discontent and keeping the flame of reform alive. They could rally support from across the Mediterranean, turning their personal grievance into a cause célèbre for all who felt oppressed by the concentrated power of the Senate. The Roman emperors who later consolidated power feared these symbolic figures immensely, precisely because they could not be defeated in a straight fight. You can defeat an army, but how do you defeat a story? How do you arrest an idea whose messenger is already beyond your reach, speaking from a platform of undeniable moral authority built by your own act of banishment? The exiles' power lay in this symbolism. They embodied the cause of justice itself, and that was a banner around which thousands could rally. But to truly appreciate the cunning with which exiles operated, we must first understand the very systems designed to control them. The legal and social frameworks surrounding banishment in the ancient world were not simple acts of expulsion. They were intricate, carefully crafted institutions that reflected deep societal values and fears. Far from being a chaotic or arbitrary punishment, exile was often a formalized process, a release valve for political pressure that, in a stunning paradox, handed the outcast a rulebook for their own reinvention. This complex duality, where the state's method of neutralizing a threat inadvertently provided that same individual with a manual for building power abroad, is key to unraveling the exile's advantage. By examining the distinct legal philosophies of Rome and Greece, we see how these frameworks, meant to protect the state, ultimately armed their opponents with legitimacy and a roadmap for operating beyond its borders. In ancient Rome, the concept of exilium presented a fascinating legal escape hatch, a stark choice between two grim fates. For a Roman citizen convicted of a capital crime, the sentence was typically death. However, the law provided a grim alternative. Before the sentence could be carried out, the accused could voluntarily choose to go into exile. This was not a sentence handed down by a judge, but a preemptive, self-imposed banishment. By fleeing across the sea, usually to a Greek city or a friendly territory, the individual effectively renounced their Roman citizenship and all the protections that came with it. In the eyes of Roman law, they were now legally dead, their property was confiscated, and they could be killed on sight if they ever returned. On the surface, this seems like a brutal and total erasure. But for a shrewd and well-connected Roman noble, exilium was a calculated strategic retreat. It transformed a definitive, absolute punishment execution into a conditional one. It traded a swift, dishonorable death for a life, however diminished, with future potential. This legal pathway provided something crucial: clarity. an exile knew exactly where they stood. They understood the boundaries of their punishment and, more importantly, the vast world that lay outside of it where Roman law held no sway. This clarity allowed them to plan. They could liquidate assets and send wealth ahead of them, secure letters of introduction to foreign leaders, and identify potential allies in their future home. The Roman system, designed to cleanly remove a problematic citizen without the messy spectacle of a public execution, instead gifted them a structured, legal method to leave the board and immediately begin playing a new international game. The Athenian approach, known as ostracism, was even more revealing of the societal anxieties around concentrated power. Unlike the Roman model, which dealt with crimes, ostracism was a purely political safety valve, a uniquely democratic invention aimed at preserving the democracy itself. Once a year, the Athenian assembly would be asked a simple question: is there any citizen who has grown so powerful, so popular, or so potentially threatening to the egalitarian balance of the state that they need to be removed? If the assembly voted yes, a second vote was scheduled. Citizens would inscribe the name of their choice on a piece of broken pottery, an ostracon, and deposit it in the agora. If any single name received at least 6,000 votes, that individual was required to leave Athens for a period of 10 years. Crucially, this was not a dishonorable punishment. The person ostracized was not deemed a criminal. They were not exiled for treason, corruption, or impiety. They were exiled for being too successful, too influential, too big for the fragile democratic ecosystem. Their property was not confiscated, and their family could remain. They retained their citizenship and their wealth, and they were welcomed back after the decade had passed. This framework was profoundly telling. It demonstrated that the Athenians feared the rise of a potential tyrant from within their own ranks more than they feared any external enemy. But in doing so, they created a factory for producing highly educated, well-funded, and politically savvy outcasts. An ostracized leader left Athens not as a destitute fugitive, but as a wealthy, respected, and deeply knowledgeable ambassador of Athenian culture and strategy, a walking treasure trove of intelligence any rival state would be eager to acquire. The very process designed to prevent tyranny by removing a threat instead packaged that threat and delivered it gift-wrapped to Athens' adversaries. These legal frameworks, for all their differences, shared a common and critical flaw. They only defined the act of removal, not the consequences of it. They meticulously outlined how and why someone was to be cast out, but they were utterly silent on what that person should do once they were beyond the border. This legal vacuum is where the exile's power was born. The state, having followed its own elaborate rules for banishment, considered the matter closed. The threat was gone, but for the exile, their story was just beginning. The Roman who chose exilium was now free to offer his legal expertise and political connections to a Roman client king in the East, helping him navigate the complexities of dealing with the Senate. The Athenian statesman, ostracized for his ambition, could travel to the court of the Persian King of Kings and offer a detailed analysis of Athenian foreign policy objectives and military vulnerabilities. These legal systems provided a perverse form of empowerment. They granted the exile a clear, legitimate status, not here, which then became a badge they could wear in foreign courts. They could present themselves not as fugitives fleeing justice, but as political refugees, victims of their own excellence, unjustly cast out by a fickle democracy or a jealous oligarchy. This narrative was a powerful tool for winning sympathy and patronage. The frameworks of exile, in their elaborate attempt to create order, instead created a sanctioned class of international free agents, individuals who were legally dead to their homeland but very much alive and extremely dangerous to everyone else. Now consider the most valuable currency in the ancient world, more precious than gold or silver, information. For an exile cut off from the familiar rhythms of home and stripped of official power, intelligence became their lifeblood and their primary weapon. They existed in a unique informational sweet spot. They possessed intimate, insider knowledge of their homeland's politics, military secrets, and social vulnerabilities. Yet they were now physically outside of it, free to observe from a distance and to offer that knowledge to anyone willing to pay the price. This positioned them as the ancient world's most effective and unpredictable intelligence agents, a decentralized network of spies who didn't need to be recruited because their desperation and ambition made them volunteer for the role. In an era long before satellites, encrypted messages, or formal spy agencies, the Exile was the ultimate information broker, and their services could make or break empires. The mechanics of how they gathered this intelligence were as ingenious as they were varied. An exiled Athenian general wouldn't just sit idly in a Persian palace. He would become a hub of information, leveraging every connection he had left. Trusted servants still loyal to him might remain in Athens, sending coded messages aboard merchant ships about political developments or military preparations. Other exiles scattered across the Mediterranean formed a kind of informal postal service, sharing rumors and confirmations they picked up in their own host cities. A former Roman senator, welcomed into the court of a Parthian king, would make a point of befriending the Greek tutors of the royal children or the Phoenician merchants who supplied the palace, gently pumping them for news from the west. They became masters of listening, of reading between the lines of official proclamations, and of piecing together a coherent picture from 100 scattered fragments of gossip and report. Their survival depended on it. A shift in the political winds back home could mean a death sentence if their host king decided they were no longer useful, or it could mean a sudden opportunity for recall if a rival faction took power. This constant, desperate need to know turned every exile into a highly motivated, self-funded intelligence operation. Perhaps no one played this game with more audacious skill than Alcibiades, the brilliant and treacherous Athenian we met earlier. His entire career in exile was a masterclass in information arbitrage. After defecting to Sparta, the information he provided wasn't just tactical. It was deeply cultural and psychological. He didn't just tell the Spartans about Athenian battle plans. He explained the Athenian character. He advised them to fortify Dicelia, not just as a military stronghold, but as a psychological blow, because he knew how deeply the constant threat would demoralize the Athenian populace. Later, when he fled to the Persians, he performed a breathtaking double game. To the Persian satrap Tissaphernes, he offered insights into the petty squabbles and internal jealousies of the Greek city-states, advising him on how to prolong the war by alternating his financial support, thus keeping the Greeks weak and dependent on Persian gold. Simultaneously, he sent messages back to the Athenian fleet at Samos, presenting himself as the only man who could eventually win Persian support for Athens and bring them victory. He was selling a different version of the same truth to both sides, positioning himself as the indispensable key to understanding the enemy. His power derived entirely from his role as the sole interpreter of this complex informational landscape. This role made exiles uniquely dangerous because their loyalty was always and obviously for sale to the highest bidder. A king could never fully trust them, but he also couldn't afford to ignore them. Their value was simply too great. Imagine a Parthian Shah considering an invasion of Roman Syria. His own scouts could report on legion placements, but they couldn't tell him about the deep-seated rivalry between the two Roman legates commanding those legions, a rivalry that could be exploited to paralyze their response. Only an exiled Roman official who had dined with those very commanders and witnessed their arguments firsthand could provide that crucial context. This kind of human terrain mapping, understanding the ambitions, fears, and personal weaknesses of key players was the Exile's specialty. They provided the narrative behind the map, the story behind the strategy. In this way, Exiles became the essential lubricant in the gears of ancient diplomacy and warfare. A king didn't just consult his generals and priests, he consulted his exiles. They were his living libraries of strategic intelligence, his walking, talking databases on every rival state. Their very presence in a royal court elevated the level of game being played, forcing other powers to also acquire their own exiled advisors just to keep pace. This created an entire shadow economy of information, where the most sought-after commodity was not a physical resource, but a human one, a knowledgeable person with a grudge and a sharp mind, ready to trade the secrets of their homeland for a chance at redemption, revenge, or simply a comfortable life far from the city that had cast them out. They proved that in the ruthless calculus of power, knowledge was not just power, it was the ultimate sanctuary. But while military might and economic leverage were potent tools, some exiles discovered a form of influence far more subtle, enduring, and ultimately more transformative than any army or fortune, the quiet, pervasive force of soft power. This is the ability to shape the desires and beliefs of others not through coercion or payment, but through the compelling attraction of one's culture, political values, and ideas. For an exile stripped of physical resources and official authority, this became a supreme weapon. It allowed them to critique the very regimes that had cast them out, to propose radical alternatives, and to build a legacy that could outlast dynasties, all without ever raising a sword or commanding a single soldier. Their platform was not a throne, but the human mind itself, and their reign was measured in the centuries-long endurance of their thoughts. The cynic philosopher Diogenes, originally exiled from his hometown of Sinope for a scandal involving defaced currency, embodies this principle in its most raw and provocative form. Arriving in Athens with nothing but his cloak and a wooden bowl, Diogenes didn't seek to build an army or amass wealth. Instead, he launched a relentless campaign of ideas, using his own life as a public performance art piece to challenge every convention of Athenian society. He lived in a large ceramic jar, urinated in public, and masturbated in the marketplace, not out of mere madness, but to make a devastating philosophical point, that the pursuit of wealth, status, and social approval was a hollow trap, a form of self-imposed slavery. His exile had liberated him from all societal obligations, allowing him to live with a radical freedom that both shocked and fascinated his contemporaries. People flocked to see him not because he had any power to reward or punish them, but because his shocking actions and sharp wit exposed the absurdities of their own lives. He famously told Alexander the Great, the most powerful man in the world, to stop blocking his sunlight, a breathtaking act of defiance that demonstrated a king held no sway over a man who desired nothing from him. Diogenes' power came from his unimpeachable consistency and his mastery of the symbolic act. His exile wasn't a handicap, it was the essential credential that gave his critique its undeniable authenticity. He had nothing left to lose, and that made him the most fearless and therefore the most influential commentator of his age, his ideas sparking debates that would ripple through Stoic and Cynic philosophy for generations. This intellectual clout was not confined to philosophers living in jars. Exiled artists and writers wielded a similar soft power, their work shaping the cultural and aesthetic sensibilities of the ancient world from a distance. A painter or sculptor driven out of Athens might find a welcoming patron in the court of a Macedonian king or an Etruscan noble. Freed from the conservative artistic traditions of their homeland, these exiles could experiment, blending styles and introducing new forms that would have been rejected at home. Their work became a vehicle for cultural fusion, subtly transmitting the values and stories of one civilization into the heart of another. But the most potent soft power was often wielded by writers. The Roman poet Ovid, banished to the edge of the empire by Emperor Augustus, is the quintessential example. From the remote, wintry shores of the Black Sea, he wrote letters and poems that were meticulously copied and smuggled back to Rome. In these works, he didn't just lament his fate. He crafted a powerful and enduring counter-narrative to Augustus's carefully cultivated image of paternal benevolence. Ovid's poetry painted a portrait of an emperor who was capricious, cruel, and remote, a godlike figure who could destroy a life on a whim. This wasn't a call to arms. It was a slow, insidious corrosion of imperial authority through the power of storytelling and emotional appeal. Every aristocratic Roman who read his verses and felt a pang of sympathy for the brilliant poet freezing in Tomies unconsciously absorbed a seed of doubt about the man who had sent him there. Ovid's work ensured that Augustus's legacy would forever be shadowed by this act of cultural vengeance, proving that a well-turned couplet could be as damaging to a ruler's reputation as a lost battle. The ultimate strength of this exilic soft power was its immortality. A king's army disbands upon his death. His treasury is looted or squandered by his heirs. But an idea, once released into the world, takes on a life of its own. The philosophical frameworks developed by exiled thinkers like Aristotle, who taught in exile after Alexander's death, became the foundational texts for Western thought for the next 2,000 years. The histories written by exiled scholars, providing critical perspectives on the follies of their former leaders, became the standard accounts for future generations. This form of influence operated on a timescale that rulers, obsessed with the immediate present, could scarcely comprehend. They were playing checkers, while the exiles were playing a game that spanned centuries. By choosing to engage in the battle of ideas rather than the battle for the throne, these figures secured a victory that was both total and permanent. They demonstrated that the most formidable force in human history is not the power to command obedience, but the power to inspire thought. But the ultimate act of exilic reinvention wasn't just serving a foreign king or leading a mercenary army. It was the breathtaking ambition to become a king yourself, to carve a brand new kingdom from the raw, untamed edges of the map. For some of these formidable outcasts, banishment was not an end but a genesis, a blank slate upon which they could project their wildest dreams of power, unfettered by the traditions, rivalries, and political squabbles of the world that had rejected them. This was exile not as a punishment, but as the ultimate startup opportunity, a chance to trade the worn-out chessboard of Mediterranean politics for a vast new world where they could write the rules themselves. The mother city that cast them out expected them to fade away. Instead, they often eclipsed it, building vibrant new states that would one day rival and even conquer their ancient homelands. This entrepreneurial drive was woven into the very fabric of ancient Greek civilization through a practice they called apoikia, the founding of a colony. While not every colonist was an exile in the strictest sense, these ventures were frequently populated and led by those on the losing end of political power struggles, by younger sons with no inheritance, and by restless, ambitious individuals for whom the crowded city-states of mainland Greece offered no future. A famous decree of ostracism wasn't just a sentence of removal. For some, it was a de facto business proposal. An ostracized leader, still wealthy and commanding the loyalty of his followers, would gather a fleet, secure a charter from the oracle at Delphi to lend divine approval to the endeavor, and set sail not as a refugee but as an explorer king in waiting. Their mission was to find a strategic location, a natural harbor, a defensible hill, fertile land, and to plant a new, independent polis, a home away from home, that would be forever tied to the mother city by bonds of culture and religion, but would operate under its own laws and pursue its own destiny. The results of this process were nothing short of revolutionary, reshaping the entire Mediterranean world. Consider the island of Sicily, a land of immense fertility and strategic importance. It became a magnet for Greek exiles and colonists. The city of Syracuse, one of the most powerful and magnificent in the entire ancient world, was founded by such settlers from Corinth. Under the rule of its own tyrants and kings, many of whom were themselves exiles or descendants of exiles, Syracuse grew to become a major military and cultural power, so wealthy and formidable that it successfully resisted the might of Athens during the disastrous Sicilian expedition. To the south, on the coast of North Africa, the city of Cyrene was founded by settlers from the island of Thera, driven out by drought and political strife. It became a prosperous kingdom renowned for its intellectual life and its lucrative trade in a rare medicinal plant called silphium, which was so valuable it was depicted on the city's currency. These weren't mere trading outposts, they were full-fledged, independent city-states, often richer and more powerful than the older cities of Greece itself. An exile who might have been a minor political player in Athens or Corinth could become the founding father, the lawgiver, the heroic outcasts of a new city, with a legacy that would be celebrated for centuries. This model of exile-led state-building reached its most spectacular expression with the conquests of Alexander the Great and the subsequent wars of the Diadochi, his successors. When Alexander's vast empire fractured after his death, it created a power vacuum of continental proportions. Into this void stepped a generation of Macedonian generals, men like Ptolemy, Seleucus, and Antigonus, who could all, in a sense, be considered exiled. They were cut off from their Macedonian homeland, thousands of miles away, and were forced to carve out their own kingdoms in the alien landscapes of Egypt, Persia, and Asia Minor. Seleucus I Nicator provides a particularly striking example. After Alexander's death, he initially gained control of Babylon, but was soon forced to flee from his rivals, becoming a literal exile with only a small band of loyal troops. He spent years as a mercenary commander, much like the exiles of old, but his ambition was far greater. He eventually returned with an army, reconquered his territory, and established the massive Seleucid Empire, which stretched from modern-day Turkey to Afghanistan. In doing so, he didn't just found a new state, he founded an entire new era, a Hellenistic world where Greek culture fused with local traditions across a vast expanse. These successor kings, all of them effectively exiles from the core of Alexander's empire, became founders of dynasties that would last for centuries. The power of this impulse lies in its profound psychological shift. Exile, for these individuals, was reframed from a story of loss into a story of opportunity. It was a chance to start over, unburdened by the past, the constraints of the old society, its entrenched aristocracy, its cumbersome laws, its sacred groves that couldn't be moved, were all left behind. In the New World, they could design a society from the ground up. They could apportion land as they saw fit, establish a new constitution that concentrated power in their own hands, and create a new civic identity with themselves at its heroic center. They were no longer answering to the whims of an assembly or the jealousy of rivals. They were the source of law, the font of honor, the founders of a new people. This was a form of power that was both more personal and more absolute than anything they could have achieved back home. the mother city that had cast them out might look on with a mixture of envy and horror as its discarded sons and daughters raised magnificent new cities, amassed legendary fortunes, and built empires that would eventually dwarf the original in both scale and splendor. In the end, they proved that the most powerful response to banishment was not to seek revenge or even to seek return, but to simply turn away and build something better, leaving the old world to its own devices. Yet this profound transformation from political outcast to spiritual conduit raises a compelling question. What was it about the experience of exile itself that opened this door to a different kind of authority? The answer lies in the very nature of their suffering and the radical detachment it forced upon them. A king, a priest, even a wealthy merchant, they were all deeply embedded within a social and political system. Their perspectives were inherently shaped by their need to maintain their position, protect their property, and navigate the complex web of loyalties and rivalries that came with power. An exile was forcibly ripped from that web, stripped of home, status, and the constant hum of court intrigue. They were plunged into a void. This terrifying emptiness, this complete loss of all earthly attachments, became the crucible for a new kind of vision. With nothing left to lose and no one left to please, their perspective shifted from the horizontal plane of human politics to the vertical plane of the divine. They were no longer reporting on the ambitions of men. They were listening for the voice of the gods. Their physical distance from the centers of power translated into a perceived metaphysical closeness to the source of all power, granting their words and weight that no royal pronouncement could match. A king spoke for the state, an exile, it was believed, spoke for the universe itself. Nowhere is this dynamic more powerfully illustrated than with the Hebrew prophet Ezekiel, who found himself among the first wave of Judean exiles deported to Babylon after King Nebuchadnezzar's conquest of Jerusalem. Imagine his world utterly shattered. The temple in Jerusalem, believed to be the literal dwelling place of God on earth, was either destroyed or horrifyingly out of reach. The Davidic monarchy, the divinely ordained line of kings, was in chains. The entire theological framework that explained their place in the world, that they were God's chosen people in God's chosen land, seemed to have collapsed completely. In this atmosphere of utter despair and dislocation, Ezekiel experienced his famous visions. By the rivers of Babylon, far from the sacred geography of home, he saw the heavens open. He described a magnificent, bewildering chariot throne borne by 4 living creatures, a vision of divine mobility that fundamentally redefined the nature of God for his people. The message was revolutionary and comforting. God was not confined to a temple in a conquered city. God's throne was movable and could be present with them even in the heart of their enemy's empire. This was a theological earthquake. From his position of profound loss, Ezekiel provided the spiritual framework that allowed a broken people to not only survive but to intellectually and spiritually triumph over their circumstances. He provided the laws and the vision for a new kind of community, one based not on land and monarchy but on faithfulness and law, setting the foundation for what would become rabbinic Judaism. His authority did not come from any priestly lineage or royal appointment. It came directly from the devastating power of his exile-born visions, which gave a people facing cultural extinction a reason to endure and a new way to understand their covenant. This pattern was by no means exclusive to the Hebrew tradition. Throughout the ancient pagan world, courts regularly employed seers, diviners, and oracle interpreters. But these figures were deeply integrated into the power structure. Their prophecies were often expected to confirm the king's decisions or justify his wars, making them susceptible to pressure, bribery, and political influence. When one of these seers truly spoke a hard, unwelcome truth, a prediction of defeat, a warning of divine displeasure with the ruler's actions. They often faced a swift and familiar punishment, banishment. Yet this very act of expulsion could ironically purify and elevate their authority. Cast out from the corrupting influence of the palace, a pagan seer became a free agent of the divine. No longer beholden to a single patron, they could wander the land, their very presence a living reproach to the powerful. They might settle near a sacred spring or a remote mountain cave, and their reputation for uncompromised truth-telling would attract a new following. People from surrounding villages, even disillusioned citizens from the very city that had exiled them, would travel to seek their counsel. They became independent oracles, their pronouncements considered more authentic precisely because they were no longer for sale. Their detachment from the political machine became their greatest credential, proof that their visions were uncorrupted by ambition or fear. A king bound by ritual could only perform the prescribed ceremonies. An exile, having lost everything, was seen as having nothing left to mediate their connection to the gods except their own raw, unfiltered humanity. This gave them a fearsome power to challenge rulers on a level that no general or rival prince ever could, for they fought not with armies, but with the unanswerable authority of a higher truth. And so we arrive at one of the most subtle and enduring forms of power. An exile could wield the power to control the story itself. When a king banished a rival, he believed he was removing them from the narrative of power, consigning them to the footnotes of history. But what rulers consistently failed to understand was that by casting these individuals out, they were handing them the pen. Freed from the daily grind of court politics and the need to placate powerful factions, exiles possessed the time, the motivation, and the unique perspective to become authors of their own legacies. They could step back from the event and become its historian, its interpreter, its poet. This wasn't merely about keeping a diary, it was a sophisticated campaign to win the most important battle of all. The battle for how future generations would remember what happened. While a king was busy managing the present, the exile was quietly, meticulously building the past. Consider the profound advantage of their position. A ruler like Augustus had to spend immense energy crafting a public image. He erected magnificent buildings, commissioned statues that portrayed him as a wise and serene leader, and sponsored poets like Virgil to write epic verses celebrating the golden age he had supposedly brought to Rome. But this was a fragile, official narrative, constantly needing reinforcement and vulnerable to the whispers of dissent. An exile, by contrast, operated with a different kind of freedom. Their work didn't need to be approved by a censor or celebrated in the forum. It could be raw, personal, and emotionally compelling. The Roman poet Ovid, banished to the bleak shores of the Black Sea, became the master of this craft. From his remote outpost, he wrote 2 volumes of poetry, the Tristia and the Epistulae ex Ponto Sorrows and Letters from the Black Sea. These were not dry historical accounts, they were heart-wrenching, deeply personal appeals. He poured his loneliness, his despair, and his piercing cold into every line. But woven through this tapestry of personal suffering was a devastatingly effective character assassination of the emperor who had sent him there. Ovid never directly called Augustus a tyrant. He didn't have to. By meticulously documenting his own misery and framing it as the arbitrary act of a distant, unfeeling god-like figure, he painted a picture of capricious cruelty that was far more damaging than any direct accusation. Every aristocratic Roman who read his smuggled verses and felt a pang of sympathy for the shivering poet was unconsciously absorbing a version of events where Augustus was the villain. Ovid couldn't vote, he couldn't lead a rebellion, but from the edge of the empire, he could ensure that the emperor's legacy would forever be shadowed by the story of the brilliant artist he had senselessly destroyed. This manipulation of memory was not confined to personal lamentation. Greek historians who found themselves in exile turned their forced departure into a professional advantage. Thucydides, the great historian of the Peloponnesian War, was an Athenian general who failed to prevent the Spartan capture of the city of Amphipolis. For this failure, he was exiled for 20 years. This punishment, which must have felt like a professional death sentence, instead granted him the greatest gift a historian could ask for: neutrality. No longer obligated to defend Athenian actions or vilify the Spartans for a domestic audience, he could travel freely. He journeyed to the Peloponnese, spoke to Spartan commanders, and gathered perspectives from both sides of the conflict. His history of the Peloponnesian War is renowned for its critical, seemingly impartial analysis precisely because he was writing it from outside the fray. His exile lent his account an authority that a historian writing from inside the city walls could never have achieved. He wasn't just recording events, he was interpreting them from a unique vantage point, and in doing so, he defined for all time how we understand that brutal conflict. His personal defeat became the foundation of his immortal professional triumph. Other exiled writers took a more direct approach to shaping their stories. A deposed king or a disgraced politician might commission a lavish autobiography or pay a friendly historian to produce a flattering account of their reign, to be distributed to libraries and influential figures across the Mediterranean. These works would justify their actions, downplay their failures, and magnify their accomplishments, all while painting their rivals as short-sighted, jealous, or corrupt. The goal was to create a counter-narrative, a parallel history that would exist alongside the official version sponsored by the regime that had ousted them. They were seeding the future with an alternative truth, betting that a compelling story, well told and widely distributed, would eventually drown out the pronouncements of their enemies. They understood that while kings control the laws, it is the storytellers who ultimately control the legacy. An exile's most powerful act of revenge was often not raising an army, but writing a book, a weapon that could strike across centuries, long after the swords of their adversaries had turned to rust. Yet within this grand narrative of exiled generals and deposed kings, a crucial layer of the story often remains hidden from the historical spotlight: the experience of women. While the chronicles are overwhelmingly filled with the tales of banished men, women of high status also faced the bitter reality of exile, and their methods of wielding influence from the shadows were often more nuanced and in some ways even more formidable. Denied the conventional paths of military command or direct political office, exiled noblewomen and queens mastered a different arsenal of power, one built on the intimate bonds of loyalty, the unbreakable ties of family, and the subtle, ruthless art of intrigue. Their stories compellingly demonstrate that exile did not silence them. Instead, it often amplified uniquely feminine forms of authority, allowing them to challenge and manipulate the rigid, male-dominated power structures that had cast them out. To understand their world, we must first step away from the battlefield and into the complex web of the royal household, the true seat of a queen's power. For a woman like Olympias, the formidable mother of Alexander the Great, her identity and influence were inextricably linked to her son's reign. As the Queen Mother, she was the heart of a vast network of patronage and loyalty. She had placed her allies in key positions, she controlled access to the king, and she was the guardian of the dynasty's prestige. But when Alexander died suddenly in Babylon in 323 BC, that world shattered instantly. The immense empire fractured into pieces fought over by his generals, the so-called Diadochi, and Olympias found herself in a terrifyingly vulnerable position. Her protector was gone, and these ambitious military men saw her and Alexander's young son, the rightful heir, not as sovereigns to be served, but as obstacles to be removed. She was eventually forced to retreat to her native Epirus, a move that was exile in everything but name, a strategic withdrawal from the center of power to avoid assassination. But from this position of apparent weakness, Olympias began to wage a different kind of war. She couldn't lead an army herself, but she could command the loyalty of those who did. Her power stemmed from her unmatched status as Alexander's mother. She was a living symbol of the Argead dynasty, a walking reminder of the legitimacy that these new, self-made kings so desperately craved yet inherently lacked. From Epirus, she became a master puppeteer of political alliances. She negotiated through letters, promised support to one general while secretly undermining another, and used her daughter's marriage to the king of Epirus to secure a base of military power. Her most potent weapon was her voice as a mother. She publicly defended the rights of her grandson, Alexander IV, penning furious letters that accused the regent Antipater and others of betraying Alexander the Great's legacy. This was not just the nagging of a grieving mother, it was a brilliant political strategy. By framing the struggle as a defense of the rightful heir against a circle of treacherous usurpers, she tapped into a powerful cultural ideal of maternal duty and dynastic loyalty, rallying support to her cause. Her exile did not diminish her authority, it refined it, forcing her to rely on the very tools that patriarchal society assumed were passive: kinship, reputation, and moral suasion, and turning them into instruments of raw political power. Olympias's story is not an isolated case. Throughout the ancient world, royal women repeatedly found that their perceived apolitical roles as mothers, wives, and sisters could become their greatest assets when they were pushed to the periphery. A king derived his power from his office and his army, things that could be stripped away the moment he crossed a border. A queen or noblewoman often derived her influence from her bloodline and her relationships, things that no decree of banishment could truly erase. An exiled man might have to offer his military expertise to a foreign court to earn his keep. An exiled woman could often operate through the private, trusted channels of diplomacy that existed between powerful families. She could write to another queen, her cousin or her aunt, and appeal to their shared experience, securing sanctuary or support through the unbreakable bonds of kinship that often transcended the petty wars of men. She could manage the family's wealth from abroad, funneling money to sympathetic factions back home, her control over the treasury remaining intact even when her physical presence was gone. This reveals a profound truth about exile and gender. For men, banishment was often a catastrophic rupture, a total loss of their public role that forced a dramatic reinvention. For women, whose power was already often exercised from behind a curtain, exile could sometimes feel like a change of scenery rather than a complete obliteration of identity. The network simply stretched, the letters had to travel farther. The Game of Thrones continued, just on a larger, more dangerous map. Their authority, rooted in the personal and the perennial, could prove more resilient than the institutional power of the men who had exiled them. By examining their stories, we see that the experience of displacement was not a single, monolithic tragedy. It was a multifaceted phenomenon that looked radically different depending on who was being displaced, and it compelled strategies of survival and influence that were as diverse and complex as the individuals themselves, forever broadening our understanding of what it meant to be powerful beyond the throne. Long before a single historical figure was ever cast out from Athens or Rome, the concept of exile was already being etched into the human imagination through the timeless power of myth. These ancient stories, passed down through generations around flickering fires, didn't just describe exile as a punishment, they presented it as the essential crucible for heroism itself. The most revered figures of the ancient world were not those who enjoyed a peaceful life in their ancestral homes, but those who were forced to wander, to suffer, and to overcome incredible adversity in foreign lands. This was no accident. By making exile the central ordeal of their greatest heroes, these early societies were acknowledging a profound truth about the human condition, that true strength, wisdom, and destiny are often forged not in comfort and security, but in the terrifying, liberating wilderness of displacement. Take the archetypal exile, the man who defined the very word for the Greeks, Odysseus. His entire story, the epic 10-year journey home from the Trojan War, is a masterclass in the transformative power of exile. Think of his starting point. He is the king of Ithaca, a victorious Greek general, a man who should be sailing home to a hero's welcome. Instead, he is cursed to wander, battered by storms, shipwrecked on unknown islands, and subjected to a relentless series of temptations and horrors. He is held captive by the nymph Calypso, offered immortality and eternal pleasure if he will only forget his home and his past. A lesser man would have accepted. But Odysseus's yearning for Ithaca, for his identity as a king, a husband, and a father, is the core that cannot be broken. His exile is not a void, it is a brutal school. Each challenge forces him to adapt. He must be a warrior, a cunning liar, a persuasive speaker, a patient beggar, and a resilient survivor. He learns the customs of strange cultures, from the luxurious Phaeacians to the monstrous Cyclopes. His famous cunning, his metis, is sharpened to a razor's edge precisely because he is constantly operating in unfamiliar territory, where the old rules no longer apply. By the time he finally returns to Ithaca, he is not simply the same man coming home. The proud, glory-seeking warrior of Troy has been stripped away and rebuilt into something more complete, a wiser, more empathetic, and infinitely more resourceful ruler. His exile didn't diminish him. It equipped him with the multifaceted skills needed to reclaim his kingdom and restore order. The story of Odysseus told every Greek that to be cast out was to be tested by the gods, and to survive was to earn a wisdom that those who never left home could never possess. This theme was so potent that the Romans, in crafting their own national epic, placed exile at the very foundation of their identity. Virgil's Aeneid is the story of Aeneas, a Trojan prince who escapes the burning ruins of his city, carrying his elderly father on his back and leading his young son by the hand. He is the embodiment of the exile, tasked by the gods with a seemingly impossible mission, to find a new home in a distant land he has never seen, Italy. His entire journey is a relentless series of false starts and heartbreaks. He tries to settle in Thrace, in Crete, in Carthage, and each time he is forced by fate or divine intervention to abandon the comfort he has built and set sail again. His love affair with the Carthaginian queen Dido is particularly tragic. He finds genuine love and the offer of a kingdom, but he must sacrifice it all to fulfill his destiny. This is the core of the exilic archetype, the burden of a greater purpose that outweighs all personal happiness. Aeneas's piety, his unwavering commitment to his duty pietas, is proven not in battle, but through the relentless hardship of his wanderings. He is not a hero because he wins a war. He is a hero because he endures the profound loneliness and sacrifice of exile without losing sight of his goal. And what is that goal? To found the city that will eventually become Rome. The entire Roman Empire, in Virgil's telling, was born from one man's exile. This was a powerful piece of national propaganda, but also a profound philosophical statement. It told every Roman citizen that their world-spanning civilization owed its existence not to a comfortable origin, but to a traumatic displacement, to the resilience of a refugee who turned total loss into the greatest of gains. These mythical narratives did more than just entertain. They created a cultural script for real-life exiles to follow. A disgraced Athenian nobleman forced onto a ship after an ostracism vote wouldn't just see himself as a political victim. In the solitude of his journey, he might consciously or unconsciously channel the spirit of Odysseus. His situation was reframed from a shameful defeat into a heroic trial. His journey to the court of a Persian satrap became his encounter with the Phaeacians. His need to persuade a foreign king of his value became a test of his cunning, his metes. These stories provided a framework for understanding suffering and a template for action. They normalized the experience of displacement and offered hope that the journey, however arduous, could lead to a triumphant return or the founding of a new legacy. The myths acknowledge the pain of exile. Odysseus's tears on Calypso's beach, Aeneas's despair as he sails away from the weeping Dido, but they always paired it with the promise of transformation. They taught that to lose your home was not to lose your purpose. In fact, it might be the only way to discover its true, world-altering dimensions. In a very real sense, these ancient stories were the first guidebooks for the powerless, manuals that taught how a man with nothing but his wits and his will could navigate a hostile world and emerge not just intact but legendary. It seems like a masterstroke of political genius. Remove your most dangerous rival, not by the bloody, unpopular act of execution, but by the clean, surgical tool of exile. Send them away far from the levers of power and let them fade into a quiet, distant obscurity. For ancient kings and ruling councils, this was the preferred method for dealing with threats that were too popular, too well-connected, or too prestigious to simply eliminate. Execution created martyrs. Their blood could stain the streets and fuel the fires of rebellion among their supporters. But exile was a quiet erasure. It allowed the ruler to maintain an air of mercy and legality while effectively removing the problem from the board. The underlying calculation was brutally simple: out of sight, out of mind. A rival languishing in some distant province or foreign court was a rival neutralized, their influence severed from its source, their voice silenced within the walls that mattered most. It was the political equivalent of putting a dangerous animal in a very large, very remote cage. The problem was, these were not mere animals. They were some of the most ambitious, resourceful, and intelligent individuals of their age, and a cage, no matter how large, was still a place from which they could plot their return. This strategic calculus, however, contained a fatal and often overlooked flaw. In focusing solely on removing the individual from their own court, rulers completely failed to account for the vast world that lay beyond their borders. They saw exile as an end point, a final destination for a political threat. But for the exile, it was merely a new beginning on a much larger stage. By casting them out, a king wasn't just neutralizing a threat, he was inadvertently transferring it. He was taking a domestic problem and internationalizing it, handing a motivated and knowledgeable adversary a global chessboard upon which to operate. The exiled rival was no longer constrained by the intricate protocols and watchful eyes of the home court. They were free to travel, to form new alliances with the kingdom's enemies, and to offer their most valuable asset, their intimate, insider knowledge, to the highest bidder. The very act meant to protect the kingdom could now expose its deepest secrets to its fiercest rivals. The remote cage turned out to have a door that opened onto a network of allies, and the animal inside was now free to gather a new pack. Perhaps no episode in history illustrates this catastrophic backfire more clearly than the aftermath of Julius Caesar's assassination, when a band of senators, believing themselves to be liberators, struck Caesar down on the Ides of March in 44 B. See, they set in motion a chain of events they could not control. Expecting to be hailed as heroes and to restore the old republic, they instead found themselves reviled by the Roman populace and swiftly outmaneuvered by Caesar's loyal lieutenant, Mark Antony. Fearing for their lives and their fading political influence, the leading conspirators, Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, made a strategic retreat. They chose exile, leaving Italy to take up governorships in the eastern provinces, Cassius in Syria and Brutus in Macedonia. This was not a dishonorable flight. It was a calculated move to regroup and gather strength far from the volatile capital. And from their bases in the wealthy Hellenistic East, that is precisely what they did. They were not received as disgraced fugitives, but as renowned champions of the Republican cause. They raised immense sums of money, levied massive armies from the local provinces and client kingdoms, and forged alliances with powerful Eastern monarchs. Within 2 years, the men who had been forced to flee Rome in fear now commanded a formidable coalition that could challenge the combined forces of Mark Antony and Caesar's young heir, Octavian. The Senate's decision to grant them these provinces, intended to placate them and get them out of the way, had instead handed them the resources to build a state within a state, an army of liberation funded by the very empire they sought to reclaim. The exiles had become an existential threat, culminating in the epic, empire-deciding battles of Philippi. This pattern of self-inflicted danger repeated itself across centuries and civilizations. A Persian Shah might exile a troublesome prince to a distant satrapy, only to find that the prince uses the region's wealth and military to launch a rebellion. A Spartan king, forced out by his political enemies, would find a welcoming audience at the Persian court, where his detailed knowledge of Spartan military tactics became a priceless commodity for planning an invasion. In every case, the ruler's short-term solution sowed the seeds for a long-term disaster. They assumed that physical distance equated to a loss of power, failing to understand that influence could be projected across vast distances through letters, through agents, and through the potent currency of shared resentment. An exile's court in a foreign land could become a shadow government, a magnet for all the discontented elements from the homeland, other exiles, ambitious merchants, disgruntled soldiers, all drawn together by a common goal of return and revenge. The king, sitting comfortably on his throne, surrounded by sycophants, often remained blissfully unaware of the storm gathering just beyond the horizon, a storm he had personally authorized by signing the order of banishment. The ultimate irony, then, is that the tool designed to preserve stability became a primary engine of instability. Exile was meant to be a firebreak, a way to contain a political blaze. Instead, it acted like a wind, scattering the embers far and wide, where they could ignite new and much larger fires in unexpected places. The ruler who believed he was being shrewd and merciful was, in reality, being dangerously short-sighted. He was creating a class of super-powered adversaries, individuals who were now free from the constraints of loyalty and protocol, armed with a personal grudge and a doctorate-level understanding of their homeland's weaknesses. He was forcing himself to confront not a contained domestic rival, but a monster of his own creation, a monster that had grown larger, angrier, and infinitely more dangerous with every league it traveled from home. Yet it was not only in the grand arenas of politics and war that exiles left their mark. Some of their most enduring contributions emerged from the workshop and the drafting table, where a mind freed from convention could spark a revolution in practical ingenuity. When a brilliant engineer or a visionary inventor was cast out from their homeland, they took with them more than just a grudge. They carried an entire intellectual tradition, a unique way of solving problems that was now suddenly available to the highest bidder. Stripped of the familiar support systems of their native academies and the constraints of their city's particular needs, these individuals were forced to adapt their knowledge to new challenges, often leading to breathtaking leaps in technology and tactics. Their displacement became a catalyst for a kind of intellectual cross-pollination, where the advanced theories of one culture could be applied to the practical problems of another, accelerating progress in ways that would have been unthinkable if everyone had simply stayed home. Consider the legendary figure of Archimedes, the great Syracusan mathematician and engineer. While he himself was never formally exiled, his story is powerfully emblematic of the value a single brilliant mind could hold for a state facing existential threats. During the Roman siege of Syracuse, Archimedes designed a series of incredible war machines, giant claws that could lift entire ships out of the water and dash them against the rocks, arrays of mirrors that could supposedly focus sunlight to set fleets ablaze. He was a transformative asset, a force multiplier who used abstract geometry and physics to alter the very balance of power on the battlefield. His legend resonated so powerfully because it illustrated a universal truth, that a patron who could attract such genius, whether through invitation or by offering sanctuary to an exile, could gain a decisive technological edge. This lesson was not lost on the rival empires of the age, who actively competed to recruit the finest technical minds, many of whom were precisely the kind of free-thinking individuals likely to have been ostracized or undervalued in their own conservative city-states. This created a vibrant, if unofficial, network of exiled innovation. A Greek engineer from Syracuse or Athens, finding himself out of favor or simply in search of a more generous patron, might make the long journey east to the opulent court of the Persian King of Kings or one of his satraps. There he would encounter a civilization with vastly different priorities and an immense appetite for large-scale infrastructure projects. The Greeks excelled at theoretical mechanics, geometry, and the principles of physics. The Persians, masters of administration and empire, were brilliant at organization, logistics, and mobilizing vast labor forces. An exiled Greek engineer could combine these strengths, applying his theoretical knowledge to Persian ambitions. He might design a new, more efficient water-lifting device for the royal gardens at Susa, or improve the ventilation systems for the extensive underground irrigation tunnels known as qanats, which were the lifeblood of agriculture in the arid Iranian plateau. He could advise on the construction of more durable bridges for the royal road, or design more powerful torsion catapults for the Persian army's sieges. In this new environment, his ideas were not just academic exercises, they were tools for building and sustaining a global empire, and his value was measured in the concrete advantages he provided. This cross-cultural exchange worked in both directions. Persian knowledge of astronomy, metallurgy, and agriculture, gained from the far reaches of their empire, could filter back to the Greek world through these same channels of displaced individuals. An exiled Persian nobleman welcomed at a Macedonian court might bring with him advanced techniques for steel-making or new astronomical charts that improved navigation. The exile, acting as a living bridge between cultures, became a conduit for the most valuable commodity of all, practical knowledge. Their very lack of roots allowed them to be perfectly objective. They were not wedded to the way things had always been done back home. They were free to experiment, to combine the best ideas from different traditions, and to innovate without the burden of local prejudice. A siege engine designed by an exiled Athenian for a Persian army might incorporate elements he had seen used by Phoenician sailors or Egyptian builders, creating a hybrid machine more effective than anything built in a single culture. This technological diaspora meant that progress was no longer confined by national borders. An advance in weaponry or architecture developed for one king could, through the movement of exiled engineers, quickly become available to his rivals, forcing a constant and rapid arms race of innovation across the entire ancient world. The exile, often motivated by a simple desire for survival and patronage, inadvertently became an agent of accelerated progress, proving that sometimes the greatest leaps forward occur when a brilliant mind has nowhere left to call home but the entire world. And so the timeless strategies honed in the agoras and forums of antiquity did not vanish with the fall of empires. They simply evolved, finding new life in the interconnected, digital landscape of our modern world. The core dynamics of exile, turning isolation into a network, knowledge into a weapon, and a personal grievance into a global cause, are more relevant today than ever before. We live in an age of unprecedented mobility and connection, where physical borders are increasingly porous to information, capital, and influence. This globalized environment has created a new class of digital exiles, individuals who may be physically banished or who choose to operate from the periphery, yet who wield an impact that can shake the very foundations of power. They are the whistleblowers releasing troves of secret documents from anonymous hotel rooms, the political dissidents coordinating protests via encrypted apps from a foreign capital, and the expatriate entrepreneurs building vast fortunes and cultural influence from a headquarters an ocean away from their homeland. Their playbook would be instantly recognizable to a Themistocles or an Alcibiades, updated for the 21st century with silicon and fiber optics instead of papyrus and triremes. Consider the powerful parallel of modern whistleblowers. Figures like Edward Snowden or Chelsea Manning found themselves in a position strikingly similar to that of an ancient Roman official who chose exilium. Confronted with actions by their own government that they believed to be immoral or illegal, they made the conscious decision to break ranks, but rather than simply fleeing, they took with them the most valuable currency of the modern state, classified information. This insider knowledge was their leverage, their ticket to sanctuary, and their tool for change. Snowden's journey from Hawaii to Hong Kong and finally to Moscow mirrors the path of an ancient exile seeking refuge in a rival power. He offered his insights into the vast surveillance apparatus of the United States, and in return he received protection, a modern-day version of a Persian king granting an estate to a knowledgeable Athenian general. From his forced exile in Russia, Snowden continues to operate as a node in a global network of privacy advocates, journalists, and lawmakers, his influence radiating outward through interviews, virtual conferences, and written testimonies. He cannot command an army, but through the strategic release of information, he has commanded the world's attention for over a decade, shaping international discourse on privacy and state power in ways that echo the long-distance influence of the most effective ancient outcast. This model of influence extends beyond the realm of state secrets to the world of commerce and innovation. The archetype of the immigrant entrepreneur is a quintessential modern exile story. Countless founders of today's most powerful tech companies began as outsiders, brilliant students, or ambitious professionals who left their home countries, often due to limited opportunity or political unrest, to seek their fortune elsewhere. Elon Musk, born in South Africa, moved to Canada and then the United States, building empires in electric cars and private space exploration. Sergey Brin, who emigrated from the Soviet Union as a child, co-founded Google. Like the ancient Greek exiles who founded prosperous colonies in Sicily, these individuals transported their talents and ambitions to new soil. Their exile was often voluntary, but the strategic advantage was the same: distance from the entrenched systems and conventional thinking of their place of origin granted them a fresh perspective and the freedom to innovate without constraint. They built new networks, attracted investment from global sources, and created products that fundamentally altered how the entire world communicates, shops, and lives. Their power derives not from a political office but from their control of critical digital infrastructure and vast economic resources, a direct parallel to the ancient exiles who dominated trade routes and grain supplies to bend powerful cities to their will. Furthermore, modern political dissidents have mastered the art of exilic soft power, using technology to amplify their message from afar. A figure like Alexei Navalny, before his tragic death, operated for years under the constant threat of imprisonment, using YouTube and social media to investigate corruption at the highest levels of the Russian government. His team, much of it working from outside of Russia, functioned like a modern-day version of an exile network, gathering information, producing slickly edited videos that reached millions, and keeping the flame of opposition alive. Even from a prison cell, his voice was magnified by a global audience, his moral authority enhanced by his suffering. This is the same symbolic power wielded by Hebrew prophets or exiled Roman tribunes, now supercharged by the internet's boundless reach. A tweet from a jailed dissident can now ignite international solidarity movements and trigger diplomatic sanctions, demonstrating that the ability to shape narrative and inspire action from the margins remains a formidable force. The lessons are clear. In our hyper-connected world, physical presence is no longer a prerequisite for power. Influence can be curated, broadcast, and monetized from anywhere on the globe. The outsider, the exile, the disruptor, armed with a cause, expertise, and an internet connection, can challenge entrenched powers on a scale that the ancient world could scarcely have imagined, proving that the strategies of the ostracized are not relics of history, but essential tools for understanding the complex dynamics of power in our own time. Imagine for a moment you are an ancient king. Your greatest fear is not the rival across the city, the nobleman who plots in the shadows of your own court. You can see that man, you can predict his moves. He wants your throne, yes, but he also wants to preserve the very system that creates thrones. His ambition is contained within the walls of the palace. No, the most terrifying figure is the one you cannot see, the one you yourself created and cast beyond the border, the exile. This individual represents a threat of an entirely different magnitude, a shadow that looms larger with every league of distance, precisely because they have been unshackled from everything you hold dear. A domestic rival plays by the established rules of power. An exile rewrites the rulebook from a foreign capital, and that made them infinitely more dangerous. The core of this fear lies in a fundamental loss of control. A rival within your court is enmeshed in the same web of alliances, debts, and social obligations that you are. Their power is visible, measurable. You know their supporters, their financial backers, their weaknesses. An exile, by contrast, vanishes into a world you cannot easily monitor or influence. They cross into the domain of your enemies, your competitors, your distant neighbors who harbor their own ambitions. Suddenly, your problem is no longer a domestic issue. It is an international incident waiting to happen. That exiled general now sits in the war council of your most formidable adversary, sketching out the precise weak points in your northern defenses, the very fortifications he helped design. That disgraced prince is now the honored guest of a rival king, whispering promises of rich plunder and easy victory, if only they would lend him an army to reclaim his rightful place. You have no spies in that foreign court who can get close to them, no leverage to pressure them, no way to counter the deadly insider knowledge they are now auctioning off to the highest bidder. They are a ghost at the banquet of your enemies, and every piece of intelligence they share is a dagger aimed at the heart of your kingdom. This terrifying unpredictability is compounded by the exile's most potent psychological state, they have nothing left to lose. A nobleman plotting within your city still has his extensive estates, his prized art collection, his family's reputation, his own life. These are all assets he is unwilling to risk. His maneuvers will be cautious, calculated to minimize his own exposure. An exile has already lost it all. Their property was confiscated, their name dishonored, their family perhaps imperiled. This total deprivation is what makes them so ruthlessly effective. With no status to maintain and no wealth to protect, they can take risks that would be unthinkable to a comfortable courtier. They can propose audacious military campaigns, broker alliances with notorious pirates, or promise a foreign power territories that are not even theirs to give. There is no line they will not cross because they have already fallen as far as one can go. This renders them utterly unpredictable. You cannot bribe them because they value revenge over riches. You cannot threaten them because they already live under a death sentence. You cannot reason with them because you are the author of their despair. You are left facing an opponent driven by a pure, unadulterated vendetta, and a man with nothing to lose is the most formidable force on any battlefield. The story of Hannibal Barca, the legendary Carthaginian general, is the ultimate testament to this kingly nightmare. After leading his elephants on a brutal campaign across the Alps and terrorizing Rome for over a decade, Hannibal was eventually defeated not on the field of battle, but in the political arena back home. The wealthy merchant elite of Carthage, tired of the war and wary of his immense popularity, conspired against him. Forced to flee his own city to avoid arrest, Hannibal became the most famous exile in the ancient world. And what did this man with nothing left to lose do? He did not retire. He embarked on a breathtaking second act, offering his military genius to a series of Rome's enemies. He became a strategic advisor to King Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire, urging him to launch a massive invasion of Greece as a diversion to strike at Italy itself. Even after Antiochus was defeated and forced to make peace, a condition of which was the surrender of Hannibal, the old general escaped again. His final years were spent at the court of King Prusias of Bithynia, where he allegedly helped the king win a naval battle by hurling jars filled with poisonous snakes onto the decks of enemy ships. Until the very end, Roman senators lived in dread of his name. They could not rest until their agents finally cornered him in his 70s, whereupon he took his own life rather than be taken captive. Hannibal, the exile, haunted Rome for decades after he had lost his army, his city, and his official title. He was proof that a single determined outcast, armed with a brilliant mind and a burning grudge, could keep an entire empire in a state of perpetual anxiety. This is the profound paradox that ancient rulers eventually came to understand, often too late. Exile was a punishment that perilously often empowered the punished far beyond their original station. By casting out a threat, a king wasn't eliminating it. He was merely transferring it to a larger, more dangerous arena where his own power could not follow. The domestic rival was a known quantity, a fire contained within a single room. The exile was a spark flung into the wind, capable of igniting a blaze that could consume entire kingdoms. The very act designed to ensure a king's security could become the single greatest source of his insecurity, creating a monster that was free, motivated, and armed with the most dangerous weapon of all, the intimate knowledge of home. From the cunning diplomacy of Themistocles advising the Persian king to the brutal military campaigns of Coriolanus marching on Rome itself, the stories of these ancient exiles reveal a profound and enduring truth about power. It is not a fixed object held only by those who sit on thrones or command from palaces. True influence is fluid, dynamic, and often finds its most potent expression in the most unexpected of places in the hands of those who have been cast out, rejected, and forced to the very margins of the world they once knew. These individuals teach us a masterclass in resilience, showing that being stripped of every conventional marker of status, your home, your title, your community, does not have to be an ending. It can be the brutal, necessary beginning of a transformation, a forge where ambition is refined into a sharper, more adaptable, and ultimately more dangerous form. They learn to see the entire chessboard from a distance, to turn their intimate knowledge of home into a weapon, and to build new networks of support across borders, proving that sometimes, to truly understand a system and gain power over it, you must first be ejected from it. As we reflect on these astonishing journeys from the ancient world, it's worth turning that lens on our own lives. How might the principles that empowered these exiles apply to us today? In a modern world that often feels increasingly segmented and polarized, the experience of being an outsider, whether by choice or by circumstance, is more common than we might think. Perhaps you've moved to a new city where you know no one, started a job in an industry where you have no experience, or simply held an opinion that goes against the mainstream of your social circle. These moments of displacement, while challenging, are not without their unique advantages. They force a fresh perspective, breaking us out of comfortable routines and inherited ways of thinking. They demand innovation, creativity, and the building of new connections, much like an exile forming alliances in a foreign court. The next time you find yourself feeling like the outsider, remember the legacies of Themistocles and Coriolanus. Consider that your position on the periphery might not be a weakness, but a hidden source of strength, granting you a clarity and a freedom to maneuver that those in the center simply do not possess. If this journey through the shadows of history has sparked your curiosity about the hidden forces that shape our world, we would love to hear your thoughts. What other historical paradoxes or forgotten figures deserve a deep dive? Share your ideas and reflections in the comments below. Your insight might just inspire our next investigation. For more content that unravels the mysteries of the past to better understand the present, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thank you for joining us on this exploration. Remember, the course of history is rarely changed by those who comfortably fit in. It is shaped by those who are forced out, who adapt, and who ultimately return, not to reclaim an old throne, but to build a new